Welcome everybody to this WineGB webinar on yield forecasting. I'd just like to very quickly introduce everybody, and if you don't know me, I'm Jo Caldroy, WineGB Operations Manager. So this evening, welcome to our speakers. We have Greg Dunn from Plumpton College. We have Ben Cancellor from Nye Timber Vineyards and Emma Rice from Hattingley Valley Vineyards. The presenters will give their presentations, and then afterwards we'll have time for Q&A. And to ask questions, which you can do during the presentations, but we'll answer them towards the end, use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This is being recorded and will be on the WineGB website in a few days' time. And I will now disappear and hand over to Greg.
Welcome everyone to the seminar on yield forecasting. I'm going to give a little bit of context and a bit of background before I hand over to Ben. I'll just share my screen so we can have a look at what I'm going to talk about. So the subject today is yield forecasting. It just takes a little while before it comes up. So I'm Greg Dunn from Plumpton. I've spent a bit of time over the years working with yield forecasting, so I do have some history in the subject. There are a couple of things that would make our wineries and vineyards work a lot better and a lot more productively, and they are being able to know how much fruit's out there and being able to stabilise the amount of fruit that's out there, so being able to stabilise yield from one year to the next. Today we're going to talk about knowing how much fruit's out there. So it's important to both vineyards and wineries. It's important in the vineyard because you need to organise harvesting, you need to organise the intake of fruit, you need to organise labour. I think it's fair to say that the biggest benefits to good yield forecasting flow to the winery. So most of the benefits of a forecast are in the winery, and they're things like scheduling intake, allocating fermenter space, allocating tank space, purchasing things like oak and other things that you need. You know, if you purchase oak and you don't have enough fruit to fill that oak, you're wasting money. Or if you purchase not enough oak and you've got enough fruit to put in that oak, you're not making the most of your fruit. So there are implications that flow to the winery like that. There's managing stock, forecasting production, labour planning, purchasing ingredients, and any sort of marketing efforts. So that yield forecasting, getting yield forecasting right, has some very large economic implications, but also quality implications in terms of the wine that we make. When I started to work with yield forecasting some years ago now, we were after what winemakers expected to see from a forecast. We realised that, particularly in the Australian wine industry, that there are winemakers and there are vineyard managers. Over here, it's a little bit more vertically integrated, but back then we realised that the customer of a forecast was actually the winemaker. So one of the things we wanted to do was try and find out what winemakers expected from a forecast. So what would they like to see? And almost invariably, winemakers said that they would be happy if their forecasts were plus or minus 5% out. So that's what they'd be happy with. There was the odd winemaker who said plus or minus 0, but most of them were said plus or minus 5%. We had access to some industry performance data. So we had a medium-sized vineyard, a lot of different sites in Victoria in 2000. We had some forecasts, well, a lot of forecasts from a very, very large wine company in 2001. These were forecasts made after fruit set, so they were made in January in the Southern Hemisphere, and they were out by about plus or minus 33%. So you can immediately see that there's a mismatch between what the winemaker expects and what the forecaster, which was often the vineyard manager, was able to produce. The result of that is it causes a lot of friction, so a lot of stress, particularly during harvest, a lot of conflict and stress, a lot of waste and error, depressed profitability. And this is a difficult thing to measure because under forecasts have different implications to over forecasts, but there are costs to getting both of those wrong. And back at the time we did this, we thought that our conservative estimates were that it was costing the Australian wine industry about $85 million a year at the unreliable forecasts. So it's an important issue for a whole lot of reasons. In terms of giving you background, one of the important things is, particularly in vineyards, is there's a lot of variation, which always makes forecasting a difficult thing. When we talk about variation in vineyards, we separate it between temporal variation and spatial variation. So vineyards will vary over space across the vineyard. There'll be a lot of variation, but there's also a lot of variation in yield from one year to the next. And getting your forecasting right is about understanding both of those sources of variation and accounting for them. So we'll talk a little bit about variation. We'll discuss when you can usefully make forecasts, what you need to do, what I think you need to do to get it right, what you may have heard of, some of the options that work and some that don't work, and some options that are coming online for the future. So that's what I'll cover in the next 15 or so minutes. One of the things we looked at is the psychology of forecasts and why grower forecasts were inaccurate. And I'm going to show you a couple of forecasts here from an experienced vineyard manager. We had access to these forecasts. Here's the first one. Doesn't matter what it is. Maybe it's a block of Chardonnay. And you can see its yield varying between sort of 25 and close to 60 tonnes a hectare. It's a reasonably stable block. So there's average yield. Here is the forecaster. So the vineyard manager came in 1996. He made his first forecast, which was a bit lower than yield. In the next year, he adjusted that. He got it pretty close to right. The following year, he picked the small downturn. The year after that, he picked a small upturn. So you could say that he's a pretty good forecaster. He understood his block. He knew what he was doing. Plus, 11% absolute difference. So all those forecasts averaged out at being 11% out. So, he understands forecasting, he knows what to do. Let's move to another vineyard, different block of vines, far more variable, a lot of seasonal variation, going up and down between, say, 40 tonnes and around about 81 or 82 tonnes. And here's the vineyard, there's the average. Here's the very same vineyard manager. So he came in 1996, he underestimated yield. The following year, he adjusted by going up and he completely missed this massive downswing. He picked the downswing in the following year. He picked the upswing in the last year, but he didn't adjust by as much as production went up. So this is the same person, and it's showing you that a couple of things. One of the things is it's showing you that the ability to forecast is often affected by the stability or the variation of the block. But we worked out that growers have a good feel for average production over time. Like, they understand on average what their blocks are going to produce, but they don't adjust as much as production actually deviates. So they know that yield is going to be up, but they don't believe it's going to be up as much as their numbers tell them. They know it's going to be down, but they don't believe it can possibly be down by that much. So although you might have a good feel for production, it's important to actually collect the numbers and believe your numbers. And this is one of the things that came through, particularly in years that were very large years or very low production years. We'll leave that for a minute and we'll look at where variation comes from, because this is important for how we forecast yield. We can separate yield for a grapevine, or you can do this for a vineyard if you want, into its components. So if we look at the yield of a vine, the weight per vine, it's a function of how many bunches are on that vine, or I've called them clusters here, how many berries on average are on those clusters, and the weight of the individual berry. So when you multiply those things out, you end up with the weight of the vine. These things are called yield components. We looked at these yield components over time, and we looked at how they varied with yield. And an example of this is a block of grapevine from Coonawarra. On the Left-hand side, you can see a graph that's showing you that yield with the closed black circles is going from initially in 93 to around about 200 tonnes up to 400. And, you know, at the end of 2003, it was down about, I don't know, 60 or 70 tonnes. So you can see yield, the closed circles going up and down. What the open circles show is bunches per vine. So you can see in this instance, bunches per vine is very closely tracking yield per vine. This was interesting because Coonawarra is a region that is known to be beset by fruit set issues. And if you were going to see variation in yield, you might expect a lot of it would come from berries per bunch and not bunches per vine. But when you look at the 10 years of data there, a little over 10 years, you can see that a lot of the variation is explained by bunches per vine. And that's what the graph on the right-hand side shows you. Bunches per vine is on the x-axis, tonnes are on the y-axis, and you can see bunches per vine is actually explaining 86% of the variation in yield. This is quite important. And what we found when we looked across a lot of Australian wine regions, and we looked at, you know, the three classic varieties that are grown in Australia, Shiraz, Cabernet and Chardonnay, and we went from cool regions all the way through to very warm regions, that the biggest contributor to year variation in yield was bunches per vine. It accounted for around about 60% of the variation. The next biggest source of variation was berries per bunch. Berries per bunch is a function of fruit set, but it's also a function of how many flowers you have on your inflorescences to start with. So there are a couple of things that will determine berries per bunch. Finally, weight per berry contributed around about 10%. And you need to understand, I think, that particularly for red wine in Australia, there is an effort to control berry size for quality reasons. So that was the story across a lot of Australian vineyards. What that means for forecasting is if you want to get a forecast right, you need to start with bunches per vine and you need to put all your efforts into getting that right. Then after set, you can adjust with berries per bunch if you want. If you want to fine tune with weight per berry, you possibly can, but it's not going to deliver you a hugely improved forecast. We'll look at when you can make forecasts. There are a number of times prior to the season and during the season when you can make a forecast. You will have heard a little bit about bud dissection. So the grapevine is a perennial plant, and it has a reproductive phase that spans 2 seasons. So next season's crop is actually being formed while the current crop is going through flowering on the grapevine. So during dormancy, we can actually dissect buds and have a look at how many inflorescences or bunches there are likely to be inside those buds. And that's what the image on the bottom right corner of the screen shows. It's actually a dissected bud, so you can see the green bits are primordial leaves, the brown bits are hairs. Wine grapes are very hairy. I think it protects them from cold. And if you see the cauliflower shape, that's an inflorescence primordia. So that, all other things being equal, when that bud bursts, that will become an inflorescence or a bunch. So you can actually dissect buds prior to the season. You can do it during dormancy. We don't really use it as a forecasting tool because it's hard for us to know which buds are going to burst. There's some questions over the accuracy of the technique, and conditions during bud burst can also have a big effect on the number of inflorescences and particularly the number of flowers. So although it's possible to use, there's probably too many things going against it for us to use at the moment, but it will allow you to see whether or not yield is going to be substantially up or substantially down on previous years, which can be important. The first time you can make an in-season forecast is during spring. So you make bunch counts or inflorescence counts during spring. You should wait 6 to 8 weeks after bud burst. That's when all the shoots are going to be out. And you would use a formula like this. So you would know how many vines you had in your block. You would estimate the number of bunches per vine by doing counts. You would have to predict how large those bunches were going to be. And if you had a mechanical harvester, you would have to include a harvest efficiency factor, which most of you won't need to worry about. So that's the basic formula you would use. You can wait until after fruit set. After fruit set, we have a better idea of how large bunches are going to be. And the earliest you can do this is around about pea size. And that's the formula you would use. Once again, you would have to know how many vines per block. You would estimate bunches per vine, perhaps from a previous forecast. You would estimate berries per cluster, and that's not an easy thing to do, counting berries on a bunch. I have a technique that speeds it up substantially. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if any of you want to talk to me about a more rapid way to estimate berries per cluster, I'd be more than happy to do that. You still have to predict how large your berries are going to be, and you have to include harvest efficiency if you mechanically harvest. A lot of the work we did over a number of years showed us how accurate we could get using what we call best practice measurement-based systems. And there are different ways you can forecast, but using measurement-based systems, how accurate can you get? Bunch counts in spring, probably you can get to plus or minus 15 to 20%. And that's given resources that are normally available to making a count. The more sampling you do in the vineyard, the better that will become. But because you don't know in spring how large your bunches are going to be, plus or minus 15% is probably about as good as you're going to get. If you wait until after set, you're looking at 10 to 15%. If you make a forecast very close to harvest based on harvesting vines or segments, you can get to plus or minus 5%. That's simply a sampling exercise. So although best practice measurement-based forecasting is not going to give you plus or minus 5%, it's significantly better than what was existing at the time in the Australian wine industry. But that's just, I think the conversation needs to be between the forecaster and the winery about what is kind of humanly possible given resources in terms of a forecast, just so they're on the same page with regard to expectations. To get it right, and there's a lot in this particular slide, and to go through, to do it justice would take a fair bit of time, so I'll kind of go through it. I won't rush through it. You need to measure at the right time. So if you are going to use a berry counting estimate, you're going to have to wait until berries are at least pea size. If you're going to do it in spring, you're going to have to wait till at least 6 weeks after bud burst. So you need to make sure you measure at the right time. You need to know the dimensions of your block. It sounds ridiculous, but we were surprised when we went out early on and looked at forecasting across a whole lot of vineyards in Australia, how many vineyard managers didn't understand the dimensions of their block accurately enough to forecast. So it sounds ridiculous, but you need to get that right. You need to avoid bias. So when you bias something, like I think the last time I spoke about this is the example of if you wanted to measure the average height of men in London, you wouldn't go out to a basketball court on a Saturday morning because you would overestimate height. So you need to make sure individuals get the equal chance of being selected. So you need to avoid bias. You need to make sure that you do enough sampling, but you don't want to oversample. So you don't want to do more than what's required. So you need to do adequate and optimal sampling and use the correct formula. What helps, and a lot of people don't necessarily have the time to do this, but what helps is to evaluate a forecast. Like whenever you make a forecast, you can at harvest evaluate where the forecast has gone wrong and where it's gone right. So if you can work out why your forecast was out, whether it was your average berry weight or whether it was your bunch counts, if you collect that data every year, you can evaluate and improve your forecast. So it's a continuous improvement approach. Avoiding bias, like this is an extreme example to prove a point. When I was working in Queensland in forestry, I came down to a job in viticulture, and I asked the the technician at the time to go and collect 10 canes from 10 vines randomly in the vineyard. This was her job on the left-hand side, and there'll be no prizes for guessing where the vineyard gate was in that particular block of grapevines. So, and if in that instance, because she's collected all her samples from the bottom corner of the vineyard, it may involve some sort of bias. So I won't go through this in detail, but you need to avoid bias in your sampling. What might help you is there are a couple of products that help with yield forecasting. One's a free product and one is actually a commercial product. But we have, and I can give these to you if anyone wants this, particularly on the top there, the How to Forecast Wine Grape Deliveries is a forecasting manual that we developed. And what's really nice is there's a bit of Excel software that goes along with How to Forecast Wine Grape Deliveries that allows you to randomly sample and allows you to representatively sample and evaluate your sampling and to make your forecast. So there's a nice bit of Excel software that goes along with that. The downside is that you have to have an Excel spreadsheet for every block every year. You know, you can live with that, I think. So if any of you want to talk about either of those products, I'm happy to go through that with you. Number of things in terms of avoiding bias. You know, you don't necessarily avoid weak vines because weak vines are actually part of the population. So if you ignore weak vines, you're not capturing all of the population. You're going to overestimate yield. The same goes with missing vines, and you need to work out what you're going to do with missing vines or empty fruiting wire, but you don't just ignore it. When counting bunches, you count all bunches. We have a tendency to be very subjective about what we think is a bunch and what's not a bunch. If you're going to take this seriously, you need to be serious about that. In the UK, because most of our vines are cane pruned and most of our cluster densities are not high, I would suggest that you count whole vines. And why I would suggest whole vines instead of panels is if you count a whole panel of grapevines, if you count say 4 or 5 vines in a panel, you're carrying around a lot of numbers in your head, and it's very easy to get that wrong and to lose count and to get counting fatigue. So I would suggest single vines and more of them around the vineyard. That way the numbers will probably be between, I don't know, 10 and 30, and they'll be easy to keep in your head, and it won't tire you out. I think I was chatting to Emma about this last week, and a lot of forecasts are out because the data that goes into them is garbage. You know, people just don't take the measurements and the counting seriously. You really need to take this seriously. Otherwise, you're just going to produce a garbage forecast. So I know it's a difficult thing to count bunches on a grapevine. A lot of people don't like it. Sometimes it's hot. Sometimes they're crowded. But if you want to make a decent forecast, you have to be quite rigorous about how you do this. Bunch selection is an interesting thing. If you are going to if you're going to collect bunches for any reason, as humans, we tend to invariably select larger bunches than average. Even if you're asked to go out and randomly collect bunches and you're given a random number for every vine, you can measure along the vine and you can select a bunch that's closest to that point in space. People still take larger bunches than what's average. There's a psychology behind that. So what I would suggest is collecting multiple bunches from fewer spots. And if any of you want to talk to me about how to do that, I'm happy to do that later. In terms of adequate sampling, these are just rules of thumb. If you're counting bunches per vine or segment, probably you want to count 30 vines at the minimum. If you want to do anything with bunches, if you want to estimate average bunch weight or average number of berries per bunch, you need at least 60 bunches. And if you're going to collect an average berry weight, you need to have at least 100 berries to give you a reasonable estimate. I would prefer 200, but these are kind of rules of thumb whenever you're sampling. I don't think I'll go through that. The point of this slide is just to show you that yield forecasting can work if it's done properly and if you believe your numbers. These are some of the things that you might have heard about that may or may not work. Some people at Verizon like to go out and collect bunches and multiply the bunch weights by a multiplying factor. So they assume that between Verizon and harvest, you're going to say increase bunch weight by about 1.8. So there is a lot of excitement about that, but it tends not to work because those multiplying factors, they vary quite a bit from one year to the next. A bit of work went into this and it hasn't been very successful. Trellis tension wire, you can actually use a strain gauge on a fruiting wire to measure the weight of the vine and the yield, but that's the same as Verizon bunch weight multipliers. You have to, at some stage, multiply that weight by a factor to predict what it's going to be at harvest. Growing degree days, a lot of work's involved in that. A physiological approach by Nick DeCousley in California. A lot of work to actually generate the data that's required. Pollen counts, you may have heard of pollen counts. If you put pollen traps above a vineyard, you can count the pollen, and what that will do, it will integrate how many flowers are out there with the conditions at flowering. So a high pollen count is associated with a high yield generally. The issue is it's not useful for individual vineyard blocks, and you can't tell varieties apart. So for our purposes, pollen counts, they may be useful for yield for a whole region that's fairly contiguous, but not for an individual grapevine block. There is some scope for image analysis. I did some work on image analysis a long time ago. I think this was the first work that was published in grapevines in image analysis. What that shows is a Cabernet vine that was vertically shoot positioned at harvest, and I defruited the vine and took some digital images with a simple digital camera. At the time, we had an off-the-shelf pixel counter that we used, and we showed that there was a strong relationship between fruit pixels and yield. That's moved on a fair bit. So the idea behind image analysis, and I think this is the future, it's not here now, is that we'll be able to increase our sampling because it's remote. Hopefully it can reduce costs and labour if you're driving up and down the vineyard, and it will remove bias. So there are a lot of useful things about image analysis. And various teams around the world are looking at this. Cornell University, Rioja in Spain, University of New South Wales in Australia, sticking different cameras and different devices on vehicles in vineyards and collecting images and processing them. And we can do quite well with it. We can actually pick, assess the volume of visible fruit, and we can even, at the time the image is taken, we can even calculate or estimate what the average berry size is going to be. So we've gone a long way with this, and it's got a lot better. But the issue still is that fruit obscures fruit and foliage obscures fruit as well. And we haven't really gotten over this obscuring of fruit by other fruit and foliage. So at the moment, we're not really there with image analysis. What we have been able to do, though, is produce some nice software. So this is an example of a University of New South Wales product that allows you in a couple of seconds with a phone to reconstruct a 3D bunch and calculate the number of berries on that bunch, and also get the average berry size and the porosity of the bunch. So there are some useful things that have come out of image analysis. One other option is the weather. There are different ways to skin a cat. And just down the road from the University of New South Wales, Steve Van Slater from Macquarie University, he was a biochemist who worked in grapevines, did some work on weather-based modelling. And this is a model that's, it's a self-learning neural network model. So we threw a lot of data at this model. We looked at a whole lot of vineyards across Australia. And what Steve was able to do was, at flowering in the current season, provided he had the date of flowering in the current season and the previous season, the date of bud burst in the current season and the previous season, and he had a coordinates for the vineyard and 5 years worth of yield data, he'd get within plus or minus 12% of vineyard yield. So I think there's huge potential for self-learning weather-based models. I think this could be, in the short to medium term, far more useful than image analysis. Look, I think that's set the context for the session. A lot of people contributed to a lot of the work in those slides, so I'll just leave that up. And I'll hand over to Ben. So Ben, who's far closer to yield forecasting in the real world, can have a talk to you about his experience. So I'll stop sharing this and hand over to Ben. So let's make Ben welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, look, so I won't be going in as much technical detail as Greg did, but I'm just hoping to explain you some practical things that we do at Nightimber that may or may not help. And like Greg explained, there's more than one way to skin a cat, which is a very colloquial term, and it's just what works for the individual. So hopefully, all going well, I should be able to share my screen. Okay, can we all see that? Good. Okay, so firstly, I work for Nightimber. We've been a vineyard since 1988, and we've got one goal, and that's to make the finest sparkling wine we can. With that, as part of that process is yield estimates and getting it right and making sure all the hard work in the vineyard is ready and delivered for the winery, and there's no surprises on that process. I've worked in vineyards since 2002, and I've done harvests in both kind of Australia, France and England. So I've been involved in a number of yield estimates along the way. I've also been lucky enough to kind of make wine in those countries as well. So I appreciate both sides of the coin, the hard work that's needed in the vineyard to get those numbers right, and also the qualitative impacts it has when you get it right or when you can get it wrong. So it's not always easy, and like Greg pointed out, the more variable the vineyard, the actual harder your job is. So without further ado, we at Nightimber, we do roughly 4 yield estimates a year, and the first one starts with pruning, and we do the last one at veraison. So we go through all the the key growth stages and update the winery as the season progresses. It is valuable. So like Greg was saying, don't discount the work that you need to do for it. Do take time to do it. It's a valuable management tool for you. So it does play into what each block can do, and if you know your potential crop load earlier, you've got a lot more ability to have an impact on that crop and do what you'd like to do to get the product you want or your winemaker wants you to get. So the first rule foundation for any yield estimate is pruning, is bud numbers, and like Greg mentioned, there's our vines are dictated by the weather before the season as well as the weather during the season. So we make sure we measure that, and we can quantify that. Greg touched on bud dissection, so that is a tool we use. And once we have kind of leaf fall in November, we go around and we start sampling canes just to have a look to see how the season was and how fruitful our vines could be next year. Like Greg mentions, it's not really indicative of what your final yield estimate will be, but it just empowers you with a bit more information. So for those of you that haven't seen kind of or experienced bud dissections, it's quite hard to do. There is some human error, and it all comes down to experience. I think we all know what a bud looks like in winter. So you're trying to take cross sections of that bud with a sharp blade. So not only is there, the visual aid of the microscope, but it's indicative of your, dexterity to make sure you can make small incisions and really make accurate guesses of how many bunches are in each bud. There's 3 images here. So look, the first one is just to show those cauliflower things Greg explained. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but you can see a few of them there. The next one is just to show that there is a difference in variety. So like Greg mentioned, there's hairs inside the bud. Now that's part of the vine's protection process. And what you'll find when you do this is varieties like Pinot Meunier, which we know is a little bit more frost resistant and a little bit hardier. It has a whole lot more hairs in it. So it actually makes the buds harder to tell. Another thing is if it was a good season, you can actually see different bunch sizes. So, some seasons it's actually easier to see the bunches, and other seasons, depending on flowering conditions or the weather later in the season, disease pressure, nutrition, the bunches can be smaller. So we go through and we quantify how many bunches per bud, or in this case, primordia. And we also quantify how viable those buds are. So that third image down the bottom here, you can actually see the primary bud is now necrotic, and then we've got a secondary and a tertiary bud on each side. And look, for those of us that have experienced frost, that's what happens. The primary bud is lost, and then we're relying on the fruit coming from those secondary and tertiary buds, which aren't as fruitful. But we do those across some key blocks, and we benchmark each block each year just to see how things are looking for the next year. And we get a graph similar to the one on the bottom corner there. It allows us to make pruning decisions. So it allows us to see if buds are looking less fruitful, we got to change our tact. But it also allows us to see, where the fruitful buds are. Generally, it's the first 1 or 2 buds are less fruitful, and then from bud 3 it goes onwards, but it does differ each season, and a lot of that is just the variable spring conditions we get here. So we plug all that into our first one, and then that kind of allows us to make pruning decisions, and then with that data we go through and we make sure we prune the vines with certain goals in mind. Like Greg mentioned, it does depend on the season. So we might do all those things, but then you get a frost that comes through and it kind of does all that hard work away with. But that is the nature of what we're trying to do in a cool climate. So you do have those impacts. You can see from the experience this year, we had a late frost in May, and a lot of people unfortunately had well-developed shoots that stage, and it was a lot harder to keep those primary shoots or primary buds intact. So we then also, following pruning, we go through and we do bud counts as well and see how many successful primary buds we had out. And then with that information of how many successful primary buds we've got, we can then work out how fruitful those buds were and use an average bunch weight and get our first yield estimate of where we think we're going to be. Like Greg mentioned, that's using historical bunch weights, and they, in that sense, you are unfortunately tied to what data you've got. A lot of young vineyards, it's hard to get that information when you don't really have that data to start with, and for our blocks, we're no different. It's very hard to kind of assume what a bunch weight would be on a young vineyard with a specific soil type or a specific rootstock. But the best thing you can do is try and, like Greg mentioned, keep improving your bunch weights each year and keep that data flowing so it gets better and better. I've just got some EL stages on the right there, so it's just tying in when we like to do things. So the first yield estimate is kind of at bud burst. Sometimes it's early, it's if there's no frost, that's late April. If it's there is frost, we have to go back in May and do that. But we can then get a first estimate to see how successful pruning was and how many primary buds we've got there, and what we hope to achieve. The second yield estimate is, like Greg mentioned, 6 to 8 weeks after bud burst. So it's really, the other way to put it is, 20 centimetre shoots, 7 to 8 leaves. And for me, I find this really the most rewarding time of the year. Bunch counts are very easy, very quick to do. There's no leaves in the way, there's no shoots or other things that make it hard to see. It's quite a quick process, and you can actually do quite a lot of counts without taking too much of your time when you're crop walking. One thing though is it's great to count all these vines, but if you're going to then go and shoot thin your vine, or you're going to do other stuff in terms of canopy management, don't use those numbers before the actual action has. So use your common sense there, and if you are shoot thinning, make sure your official count is post shoot thinning. But once again, don't feel bad if you're not sure what the impact of shoot thinning is. Do a count before, so you're more empowered for your count after, and you can actually see how well the team did going through each block. With that, and all this stuff, we go back to what Greg mentioned is bias, and how you can mitigate that with sampling in the vineyard. For us, in the first estimate, when we're doing our bud counts, we really try and set a protocol for all people to follow, and then at least we make sure everyone's doing the same thing, and we're not all sampling the same 10 vines near the farm gate like that other image. We're trying to go through the block, so we just split our blocks into 3. We go zigzag up and down 2 rows going north, and then we flip over to the second third of the block and zigzag our way going south, counting vines. We find that quite an easy process to standardize, and then at least that way we're all doing the same thing. Another thing we try and do is just mitigate that risk of counting something before you get to it. Like Greg mentioned, if you come across a vine and there's no bunches, some of the people feel guilty putting a 0 on that sheet, and they'll go next to the vine next to it. So you've got to teach them that no, every vine counts, and don't feel guilty if there's nothing there. There's nothing there. So making sure you're minimizing that with the team you've got. A trick I like to do is to say, okay, I'm going up to the second panel now, and I'm going to look at the second vine, and then that way, if you count that, you already know that vine, and you're not using the visual indicators to influence your decision. You've already kind of premeditated that by giving yourself a number, and then you say, okay, now I'm going to zigzag across and go to the third panel and look at the third vine, and do it that way. And that way you can take some of that visual bias that happens away. Okay, and look, the one thing that I really appreciate from Greg's talk earlier is this is a really important time. If you do this at this stage, you can at least get within 60% of your yield estimate by just counting the bunches correctly. The one thing I do have to mention though is you've also got to pick and choose the people you want to count bunches. So we did an experiment in Australia when I was kind of working as a technical officer, and we got 2 colleagues of mine to count a data panel of 5 vines, and it was amazing to see the differences of the same 5 vines from the 2 people. We do try to kind of minimize how many people we have counting in the vineyard, so to mitigate that, because it can impact those counts. And then, like Greg mentioned, if you're spending the time to get the data, make sure the data is good and accurate, as opposed to just trying to get as much data as you can with the team you've got. Not everyone is interested in it, so make sure you try and pick the right people that have an interest, that are passionate about it, and that really care for the result itself. So the third estimate is kind of similar to where we are now, is very set. And the nice thing here is you can really start to see what the bunches look like. I think we all appreciate flowering in the UK is quite a special time. Things start off looking amazing, and then by the end of it, you can see some bunches not looking as good as they did. So you do have to allow the time for those, you know, each of those berries to become, you know, to set, or fall off, unfortunately, in some cases. So allow yourself time before you get going off to this vine, and just spend the time stripping that vine, making it as easy as you can for yourself to get the right count. We do another round of bunch counts at this stage, just to quantify kind of how, you know, the variability between the first and the second counts. But it's also here in the UK dependent on kind of pest and disease, you know, and this year I think some of us have seen some moth damage, so you can kind of quantify that with your bunches. Previous years, if it's kind of cold and wet, downy mildew has a huge impact on the amount of actual bunches you started off with to what you get after set. So it, you know, it is important to keep the numbers coming through and make sure they're relevant. And once again, you know, we go through, and depending on where the season is, we use a combination of historical bunch weights, or we begin to start doing berry counts. Again, like Greg mentioned, you know, berry counts are great. You can get a good number there, but then you still got to estimate a berry weight, which can differ depending on how long flowering goes for and kind of what heat accrual you get during flowering. So I was just trying, I know a lot of people want to get more information on what's normal for berries, what's normal for bunches. I've tried to get a few different regions here, just tabulated with an average below. Unfortunately, I couldn't get all the right years to marry up, and that England data is actually from kind of data from the last 7 years as opposed to the 2002s. But you can see just the inherent variation in bunch weights there across, you know, cool and maritime climates. And I think we can all appreciate that Pinot Noir is another one where, you know, it is quite a hard one in terms of setting. Normally, Chardonnay is a little bit hardier and will set relatively well, regardless of conditions, but Pinot Noir can be quite dependent on the heat accrued over flowering and the nutrition status and where this, you know, the season prior to as well. But there's some figures there. You know, if you have a look, the New Zealand and the Washington Chardonnay, both quite cool climates, they're quite similar for bunch weights. And then you've got a maritime climate there of the Chardonnay in Western Australia, which is taken from where I'm from kind of Bunbury through to Franklin, and we've got a lot larger weights there. But these numbers, they're great to look at. They don't really tell you much. A lot of these bunch weights are decided on kind of how many bunches per vine and how the vineyard is managed. You know, I imagine most of these were, you know, I know the Western Australian ones, they're all irrigated, and it's how much water's been put on at the right times. So you've got to take all these numbers with a pinch of salt, and this is really where the more data each vineyard can accrue on each of their blocks, the better off they are, rather than relying on other people's information, because it's not always kind of relevant. And then, yeah, we've got some berry weights there. Same thing. It's all kind of variable for what you're trying to, you know, how the crop's set up, what canopy management system you're using. But you can see, you know, there is some inherent variability there, from going down from 1.1 in 2007 for a Chardonnay New Zealand per berry to a factor of 1.64 in 2008. So that has huge ramifications for your bunch weight, and which is a big part of your yield estimate. That is our challenge here in the UK. You know, we've got these flowering conditions that aren't consistent. and they start off well, but by the time, you know, all your varieties go through, there's a big change. This year we've had one of the cooler Julys in, you know, from my time, and you can see that with some of those developing bunches. A lot of the stuff that's set early looks great, and a lot of the stuff that's set a bit later isn't looking as good. So you've got to factor that in and take the time to kind of get the data, to then trust the data for your yield estimates. It's great saying these weather generalizations, but unless you put some numbers to it, it doesn't really help you at the end of the year. Then we get to the end of the season, and this is our, you know, the final yield estimate. In all honesty, it's the 30 yield estimate that our winery uses to make sure they're empowered for what they need to do. So it's the one we put the most amount of work in. It's where we, like I said, we do another round of bunch counts. We do another, we start berry counting, and then we look at the data and we look at the variation in the data, and we actually say, well, do we want to do some more counting, or do we want to do some more, you know, how good is this? How much do we trust this? The nice thing about the fourth yield estimate, you can then really start to quantify how good those first two or three ones were. It's the conclusion of bunch counts, berry counts, and we do a thing called destructive harvesting, which all that is where we actually go through and we start harvesting bays. We just want to basically make sure that our bunch counts were true for panels of vines, and then we also start to get some berry weights to then, you know, use a, similar to what Greg mentioned, use a multiplying factor just to you know, make sure we feel that we're pretty close on that. Now, it's unfortunately by Verizon, it's a little bit late for the winery to order more tanks or to do anything like that, which I'm sure Emma will let us all know. But it does allow them, if there is a, you know, some error bars that you want to reset, it does give them some time to make a plan. And for us here, where we do a lot of hand picking, it's invaluable. You know, it tells you how many crates you put out. It you know, it gives you a lot of kind of helpful information with just the logistics of harvest, which unfortunately for a lot of us isn't as easy as just getting a machine to rock up with 30 bins. It's getting a lot of people and making sure all those crates are full. There's not too many empty ones, and there's not too many ones you need to bring in just to improve harvest efficiencies. Lastly, I've just actually got some, this is one thing I like, you know, that with all this stuff, just give yourself as much information as you can. This is for me a great visual clue on kind of what you're looking at, and to help with bunch weights or things like that. It's great to hear that there's some technology coming through where you can take a picture of a bunch and it can give you the berry size and the berry number, which will make things a lot quicker and easier in the future. It's really helpful to know. But simple tools like this is also, you know, something that just gives you a little bit more information. We've got two different clones of Chardonnay there, and I guess we can all kind of see what the bunches were like in 2018 on one side compared to, you know, what's a little bit more common in the UK, working left to right. I don't know if we want to have a competition on who can guess what bunch sizes they are, but look, there we've got the big one there on the top left is 295 grams. And then the little one on the bottom right is 67 grams. And look, I think we can all say that we've seen, you know, some of these bunches throughout all our blocks over the years. So, and there's a big multiplying factor between the difference of the two. The only way you're really going to know that any earlier than at harvest is by making sure you're doing your bunch counts, making sure you're confident in that number. Once you're confident in that number, you've got 60% of the hard work done. Then getting your berry counts, getting your bunch weights correct, and then the other 30% will fall into line. That's all I've got. So I'm going to pass everyone over to Emma, and Emma can relay the issues that come with being a winemaker and a contract winemaker in the UK. Over to you, Emma. Oh, sorry, let me get out of screen sharing. That's not, there we go.
Hi, Ben, can you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So from a winemaking point of view, things that Greg and Ben have both covered, they've covered briefly what happens in the winery as well. So, and why we need to know. I was actually traveling around some vineyards yesterday with some new clients with some very young vineyards who have never had to do bunch counts before, or or have got yields horribly wrong in the last 2 years, and asking me why should I do it? It seems like such a lot of hassle. And as a contract winemaker, I'm sending, when I'm buying, and also when I'm buying grapes from across the country, if I've got to send an articulated lorry to Essex with the right number of crates to pick the crop, I don't want to waste my money on a 44-ton lorry if I could send a 7.5 Bedford van. It's a huge cost to me, and also my crates are at a premium come harvest time, and they come into the winery, they turn around and they go back out again. They turn on a sixpence. It's there's no time to waste. I don't have excess crates. I don't have money to burn on transport and hauliers traveling all around the country. So it's absolutely vital for me as a winemaker, buying fruit from lots of different places. And same goes for wineries who've got vineyards in their own vineyards in different places as well. They need to know what transport to send for the fruit, and how many crates and how many pallets and how much shrink wrap, and how many pickers are going to be sent out, how many crates per vine, or how many vines what are you going to fit in per crate. That's Ben was referring to that as well. You don't want half empty crates coming back on a lorry. You want each crate to be full, but then you don't want them to be too full, because they start to squash before they get back to the winery. So there's all this balancing, and it's absolutely vital to have those yield estimates in place. And some people are much better at than others, and I'd say Ben is correct. You want the same people doing it, and you want consistency, and there's no substitute for building up data over the years. So been making wine in England for just over 10 years now, which is not a huge experience in the world of winemaking, but in England it's fairly extensive, because lots of people have only been doing it for a couple of years. But it's building up the data, having the bunched weights, having the bunch counts per vine is absolutely critical. And I'd say that the classic example for me was 2014, followed by 2015. 2014 was a textbook perfect growing season. Everybody was raving about it. We had a very big crop coming in. Average bunch weights in 2014 for us were about 250 grams, give or take. 2015, we went back out, we counted the bunches. We had almost exactly the same number of bunches per vine, same guy doing it. And then when it came to harvest, the average bunch weight was about 130 grams. So that's where Greg's idea of counting berries per bunch and then the weight, and working out what the weight might be is absolutely invaluable. How can you account for that variability year to year? And I think you have to accept to a certain extent in England that the extremes are worse here than almost anywhere else in the world, I would have thought, in terms of variability year to year because of the weather, the extremes of weather. And then even look, just to reiterate that, go back to 2012, where we were expecting sort of 200 odd tons off the same vineyard area. 2014, we were expecting, we got 350 tons. 2012, same vineyard area, we were expecting about 180 tons, 200 tons, because they were more immature vineyards, and we got 11. So there's, you with the best will in the world, you can't predict what the weather's going to do here in England. And I think that's been shown, particularly more recently in the opposite direction, 2018 and 19. 2018, I was panicking about this time, forcing the growers who I was working with, including the guys, my vineyard managers, to give me as accurate as possible bunch counts and accurate as possible estimates, because I could see this tsunami of grapes coming towards me, and I just knew I didn't have enough tanks to handle it. So I had to get them to tell me. Now this is where it's critical with a contract winemaking and buying grapes from contract growers. I had to say, you tell me now what you're going to get, and that will be your maximum. I cannot do any more than that. So if you get it wrong now, then it's going to be your problem, not mine, when it comes to harvest, because I've got to buy tanks now to fit this, with this huge harvest that's coming our way. And if I don't buy them now, I'm not going to get them. If you turn up with an extra 50%, I'm not going to be able to cope with it. So they were really, I gave them in very strict instructions on how to do the counts, and nearly everybody, did a pretty damn good job. And I managed to get the tanks in place in time for the harvest. And I had to buy another press as well. So that is how absolutely, that's hundreds of thousands of pounds to spend with a couple of months notice, and not to mention the logistics. So it's a very serious game. If you get it wrong and I can't take the fruit, it then becomes your problem as a grower, because I just can't magic up presses and I can't magic up tanks. And what I can't do is take everything that the guys from the east of the country are sending me early season, and then turn around to the guys here over in Hampshire and Berkshire who are coming in towards the end of October and say, oh, sorry, I've already used up all my tanks, because the other guys who came in from Essex or Kent, they were earlier than you, so I let them have it all. I can't do that. I have to be equitable and fair to all of the people I'm working with, and I have to make sure that I keep enough tank space in reserve. And it's a juggling nightmare, and it's 2018 was particularly bad for that, because everybody was producing way over, and it's very, very difficult to manage it. It's not just the tanks, and it's not just the pressing capacity. That's the immediate problems. So you can deal with that there and then, or not, as the case may be. But that problem, once the end of October's come, it's all over anyway. So the problem disappears by itself one way or another. But then if you have taken all that fruit in, you have doubled your capacity, and you've taken all that fruit, then you've got to bottle it. And bottling wine costs a huge amount of money. So buying the glass, paying for the bottling lines if you haven't got your own, or even running your own bottling line, all of the dry goods that are associated, the cages, particularly for sparkling wine, and then the storage. So where the hell are you going to put all these cages of wine that need to be aged for 2, 3, 4 years, and no sign of a market to sell it in? So at the moment, so all of these stages, you can't just take the vineyard, then the winery, and then sales independently. You have to see it as a seamless operation. And if you don't have a market for the wine, then you don't want to make it. And if you can't make the wine, then there's no point in growing it, therefore planting it. So I think it is absolutely vital that as an industry, we see the bigger picture, and we don't just chuck vines in the ground, by the hectare over the next few years, hoping that someone's going to build a winery in order to take the grapes, and then hoping that someone's going to go out there and find a market for those and those resulting wines. And it's all those stages in between, and particularly with sparkling, when you're storing the wine for up to 5 years, the cost of sticking a bottle in a cage and just leaving it there for 5 years, I think people underestimate that as well. So yield estimates, they have this knock-on effect all the way through the system. And if you can tell your export manager that you want to be selling, you're going to have an extra 100 or 200,000 bottles in 4 years' time, he or she can work out and plan and start looking for those markets now, because it does take that amount of time, and it's not there's no easy or quick answer. So anyway, if anyone has any questions specifically for the winery, then and how it affects me in the winery, or my colleagues in the winery, then please do ask. But I think in the meantime, I'll hand back to Jo.
Thank you to all of our speakers. That was, I found that really interesting. I have one question that has lined up. So you must have covered everything off because we have very few questions. One question which can be to Ben or Greg. What about diseases when it comes to forecasting? You need to unmute.
Yeah, I'll go first, Greg. So yeah, look, there's kind of disease do play a big part in your yield. Like I mentioned, downy mildew and early flowering, it can literally cause bunches to evaporate. And potentially, I think what the question may be implying is late season infection in terms of botrytis. I think that's in all of our minds from last year, 2019, and from, you know, that is the hardest part is you know, we get these autumn rains, and if we get the right amount, it's amazing. We get berry swell, we get nice big bunches, and it's just a little bit more income for us all, and unfortunately to the detriment of Emma at times. But you know, if we get too much, those berries split, and then secondary infection comes in, and then you go through this kind of very difficult stage to quantify how much botrytis there is. And you know, you also then have the knock-on effects of it slowing harvest down. It decreases kind of the speed of harvest and how many tons you can pick each day, and kind of has the knock-on effect of the processing of the winery as well. So the only answer I've got there is avoid it at all costs. So try and make sure your canopy management is really good. Try and make sure that you're doing all you can in the vineyard to limit the infection. And then if it gets to a stage where you have to start quantifying the amount of disease, it's going to be at a similar rate to what Greg suggested, where you've got a machine harvester and the machine harvester is only 95% effective. You know, that means you've got to take some of that fruit out of the equation. Greg, over to you. Any other further things to add?
No, before I say that, Matt Strugnell asked a question which I went ahead and answered online. So if any of you want to see Matt's question and my answer, just have a look at the Q&A. Corinne, a forecaster is only going to tell you at that point in time what the yield's likely to be, all other things being equal. You can't factor in disease if disease is unpredictable, but you can factor in disease if it is predictable. If you know you're going to lose 3 to 5% of your bunches every year to botrytis, you can factor that in. But you would have to know, there have to be evidence that you drop, you know, a number of bunches every year with botrytis. So unless you can predict reliably what the influence of botrytis is from one year to the next, you're going to have to just use the forecast as a forecast, as a best bet forecast with no disease. So I hope that answers your question. One thing I will add though is that some of you may or may not have seen it. There's this really nice phone app that's been produced by the University of Adelaide called PMAP, and it's used for powdery mildew, and it's a fantastic application that allows you to calibrate your assessment of powdery mildew, and it allows you to go through a vineyard, and at the end of the vineyard you'll end up with a percentage of bunches affected by powdery mildew. I see no reason why you couldn't get that application and use it for botrytis. I think it's worth looking at. So it's something called PMAP, P-M-A-P, and produced by the University of Adelaide. Fantastic application for powdery mildew, and I think you could probably tailor it for using on botrytis.
Talking about apps, Greg, how can people find out about the app that you mentioned earlier?
The app or the information?
The app for yield forecasting app that you were talking about
it's
earlier.
Not an app. What that is a manual and a bit of Excel software. And if someone wants to email me, I'm more than happy to email them the whole manual, which is PDF, and the Excel software, which tells you how to use it. So if someone wants to email me, I will send them. I'll send them that those products.
And if you don't have Greg's details, then just send me an email and I'll forward that. The question that you referred to a bit earlier from Matt Strugnall has disappeared off the screen because you've answered it. Would you like to answer it again? And it was to do with your experience of single node versus bud dissection, whether it's you or Greg. Oh, you or Ben, sorry.
There are a couple of techniques that you can use to look at fruitfulness in the previous season. So one is the simple technique, which Ben had some lovely pictures of, which is dissecting buds. So you can do that. Takes a little bit of expertise. You need to understand reproductive anatomy, and you need to understand the morphology of the bud. But once you do that, it's pretty easy, and it becomes a little bit boring, to be honest. The other way you can do it is you can set single node cuttings. So you can take canes from the vineyard and you can set single node cuttings. But to do that, you have to set the temperature in wherever you're setting these things at 25 degrees. So it takes 2 weeks for those cuttings to burst. So there's a couple of things. It's a lot more work, Matt, unfortunately. Although you can see the inflorescences more easily than counting them inside a bud, it's a lot more work. And the issue is we've known for a while now from some research done by a French guy called Pouget, which was repeated by another guy with Peter May in Australia, that the temperatures during bud burst will affect the number of inflorescences you see on shoots. So bud burst occurs around 10 degrees. If you push that up to 25 degrees for single node cuttings, you're going to get more inflorescences on your single node cuttings. So it's a lot more work, and it may give you a wrong answer. So I would suggest you stick with bud dissection, which is kind of easy as long as you know what you're looking at.
Brilliant, thank you. I don't think we have any more questions. So we've gone past 7. I think you've probably cleared off everything. So I'd just like to thank our 3 speakers. So thanks Greg and Ben and Emma. And thank you everyone for attending. The next viticulture webinar will be on the 13th of August and it'll be the second part of our canopy management. And this is being recorded, so it'll be available on the website. So I will shut down the webinar now, but thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.